Top Med Talk. Welcome back to Top Med Talk. I'm Andy Cumpstey, I'm your host today, and again I'm here at the Evidence Based Perioperative Medicine World Congress in London, so the EBPOM World Congress. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Ross Kerridge to have a conversation with us. So Ross, you've been coming to these meetings for a long time, but you gave a fantastic plenary session yesterday evening talking about your time in
thank you.
places.
Yeah, this year is 40 years since I came to London as a young doctor and got a job at Ealing Hospital, Ealing District Hospital as it was at the time, just a small hospital on the outskirts of London. But there are a few things that happened there that gave me some of the key ideas that I was able to then pursue later on when I finished my specialist training and started as a consultant in Sydney. So it's a bit of an emotional journey, and it's
And there was emotion around the room yesterday, quite rightly, when you finished talking. It was a very emotional session.
Yeah.
But you covered a lot of really inspirational points, I have to say. Lots of...
Well, thanks. Yeah.
But really powerful lessons.
Well, just recapping what I said, it's interesting thinking about 40 years. Obviously, the world's changed, but hospitals have changed as well. Hospitals used to be, they weren't quite cottage hospitals, but they still, to some extent, had the atmosphere of a cottage hospital in that they were very small or smaller institutions with a great institutional loyalty and staff that had been there forever and that sort of thing, and dominated by some of the giant personalities, both medical and nursing, of that era, many of them from the great generation, the people who had grown up in the 1930s and then served in the war, and some of their values. And sure, some of those values maybe don't fit with where we are today, but some of them are really valuable. And that has changed, and hospitals have merged and coalesced and are perhaps a little less friendly than they used to be. But on the other hand, we're much more efficient. And of course, what we're doing is just extraordinary. The amount of work that we're doing, and 40 years ago, when someone was over 60 and certainly over 70, they were almost seen as past the point of needing surgery or having surgery. And people in intensive care at that age thought they didn't have much of a chance, and indeed we wondered why we're bothering with these sorts of people. And dialysis wasn't readily available, and so things were much more in their infancy, particularly in intensive care. And we hadn't worked out what we were doing with fluids and so on. And particularly that decade in the late 80s, when pulse oximetry, capnography, propofol, laryngeal mass, the rapid developments in intensive care, evidence-based medicine, thrombolysis, coronary artery stents, and then getting into minimally invasive surgery. And in terms of surgery, back then surgery was a much bigger deal, partly because it was much more traumatic, but open surgery, of course, but even just the way the surgeons handled tissues, the trauma associated with hemostasis techniques and so on, and retractors and all that, meant that there was a much bigger inflammatory response after surgery. So patients were sicker for a longer time. Pain control wasn't nearly as good as it is now, and post-op nausea and vomiting. And so patients would, at that time, when I started, routinely come into hospital 1 or 2 days before surgery, be prepared if such a thing existed in hospital, and then the day of surgery was a big performance, and they would stay in hospital being treated on an ad hoc basis until surgeon decided they were ready to go home.
And that was one of the big lessons that you talked about yesterday, wasn't it? And you gave some good examples about improving efficiency through surgery with almost using corridors as waiting rooms at one point.
Yeah, there was a key event while I was at Ealing. One day the orderlies went on strike. And so as it happened, there was a wide corridor outside the operating theatres, and the executives came up with the idea that we would just get the theatre list for the day, go up to the wards, bring all the patients down and park them in the corridor outside the operating theatre and put a couple of nurses out there to look after them. And of course, so immediately outside the operating theatres, we could duck out and see them. There was all of a sudden, it was no trouble giving the omnipotent scopolamine premids, which were deemed as mandatory then. And in fact, the day was just a joy. It was easy to work. All the patients arrived in theatre on time, and things had never been more efficient. And that was the key event that got me thinking, why can't we do this all the time? And then over the next 5 years, as I completed my training, or 4 years, thinking about that further, about how we could do that, and then thinking, well, if we had a central area and if we had seen them in a clinic beforehand, maybe they could just come in on the morning of their operation and not go to the wards at all. And then that led on to a whole lot of things about how would you run a clinic, would everyone need to come to a clinic and all this. So I had a long time to think about it. And then when I started as a consultant, worked through those ideas, and it did take quite a long time, but eventually at Liverpool Hospital in Sydney, which at that time wasn't the big institution that it is now, I started there just as the minister announced that they were going to turn it into a big hospital. But we were able to implement this model, although it still took us 4 years to get it going.
And another lesson that you described very eloquently yesterday was when you first arrived at the cardiac arrest call at Ealing, and there was a nurse who was very scared to have put out that call.
Yes, that led on to a different innovation. But yeah, when I was at Ealing one night, called to a cardiac arrest and ran up to the ward. From memory, it was the gynae ward. And when we ran onto the ward, we were greeted by the nurse looking very worried and saying, I know it's not a cardiac arrest, but I just wanted to get help quickly, and worried that we would lose it with her saying the patient hasn't had a cardiac arrest. But I thought, well, that's a good idea. We should do that all the time. And again, when I became a consultant at Liverpool Hospital, I put this together as a proposal for what we call a medical emergency team. And that was, I thought it was such a simple idea that it was even silly to talk about writing it up. But the boss at the time said, oh no, we've got to write this up and do research on it. And that led on to the medical emergency team and what's now rapid response teams and early warning systems and so on and so forth.
But I think, again, that's another important point. Maybe you were pressured to, or maybe you were encouraged to, but you collected data on that as well, didn't you? And it was the data that had the effect.
Yep. Being young and naive, I didn't think you don't really need data to. It's such an obvious thing to do that why would you even bother, doing the data? You just implement it. But I've since learned that that's not the way the world works. You do have to gather the data and you have to work on culture. And in fact, the implementation of rapid response teams has been much more complex than I ever would have anticipated. That's why I'm not on the original paper, although they did acknowledge me in the tail end of it as that was my idea in the first place, which was nice. So,
and again, we were just talking before we came on air, if you like, about the importance of data acquisition and shared data agreements. I think that follows on quite nicely from that story.
Yeah, you do need to have the data. It's not the only thing that you need. And you may remember one of the other points I made. People say, how do you get the money and how do you convince the finance people? And I think some clinicians fall into the trap of thinking, I just need to gather the data and present that to the finance people and they will see the wisdom of my ideas and fund them. And I think it's worth remembering that the finance people are people. I think clinicians sometimes are unwisely pejorative, talking about them as the bean counters and dehumanising them. And they are people whose skill and knowledge is in making financial decisions, but they are working in hospitals. They want to know that they're doing a good job. They want to know that patients are being cared for. And I think if clinicians with ideas go and talk to them and make friends with them and have coffee every now and then and say, this is what we're doing, and even, and I have done, say, look, when you've got an afternoon, a couple of hours, why don't you come into the operating theatres and I'll just show you what we do, and making friends with them and realising that they're part of the team too. And you still need the data. They need to know that it's not totally crazy and the data needs to be honest, but it doesn't need to be quite as rigorous as for a high-end, say, drug trial or something like that.
Yes, of course.
Just need, because economics is an imperfect science, but if your finance people are emotionally involved and engaged and feel that they're part of the team too, and get what you're talking about as an idea and know that it is about doing better care for the patients and making the institution a better place, or maybe making it a better place to work, that they will find the money.
And again, that leads on very nicely to another lesson you described very well yesterday about the importance of the whole team in making those changes, and not just a frontline clinician approach, but also the paraclinical team, as you called them yesterday.
Yeah, I think particularly my big involvement in change over the years has been the whole perioperative system. But the need for just going around and talking to people and involving them and sharing your ideas and not expecting that everyone will see the wisdom of your vision straight away, and listening to their problems, because what may appear to be to you to be a very small problem, to them is a big problem. And you do need to listen to them and work that out and talk it through and share your ideas and have a working party that will keep on meeting and keep on talking through the ideas. But it's not just the clinicians, and it's not just the senior clinicians. You need the team. And I think you mentioned paraclinical. I've suggested that we should use that as a term for what are commonly referred to as administrative staff, that they are part of the team too. And maybe they don't have hands-on, but they're really important to get involved. And they have their own wisdom. They have their own concerns that you may not be aware of. And maybe if we use the term paraclinical, that would emphasise that they are part of the clinical team as well.
Absolutely.
So the finance, the secretaries, clerks, admin, cleaners, orderlies, all those people that make our hospital work, they all need to be involved, and it is a team game.
And I think that leads really nicely on to some of the things we've just heard in the first session this morning here. So we've just heard, again, fantastic session this morning, but some of the stats which really struck me were from David Probert, who's the Chief Executive for University College London Hospitals. And he started his talk by describing the current state of the National Health Service here in the United Kingdom at the moment, and pointing out that, currently we're in the largest sustained period of reduction in UK NHS funding that there's ever been, that as a country, the UK currently spends considerably less on capital healthcare than other comparable nations, and that, he's, as a leading manager in his organisation, he's faced with nearly 500 metrics a month that he has to keep track of. And he shields a lot of his clinicians from some of those targets, but those targets are there. But the pressure on healthcare at the moment is massive, isn't it?
Yeah.
And, in some ways, it doesn't feel that's a sustainable pressure. But in amongst all that, there's people who are really struggling. And we've got trainees in our region, we've got trainees nationally that are fighting really hard to get places in anaesthesia programs or intensive care programs. And very good people who are not jumping over that hurdle through no fault of their own, but because the system isn't enabling them to at the moment.
Yeah.
I think, again, you gave a really nice description yesterday about Ealing giving you a second chance and sort of pushing things through. But I think it's an important message for people to hear that although there's difficult times at the moment, there are other ways, other places, other ways forwards, and to keep pushing through, and there will be opportunities in the future.
Well, you've put me on the spot, but yes, I did. And it's something that, I haven't made a big point about, but one of the reasons I feel so much joy coming back to London every time, but particularly at 40 years. My life had gone into a hole in Australia, and coming here and getting a job here gave me a second chance to get going. And I think it's been a good thing, certainly been good for me. And I think that's an important thing. And look, the last 5 years with COVID have been really tough, but in some ways they've been really inspiring too. Yeah, particularly in those first few months, particularly in London. God, you guys got hammered. And yet, there was that sense of everyone pulling together and, being committed, and there's a joy in that. And as we said, 40 years ago, hospitals tended to be smaller and perhaps more collegial. And look, I'm not saying that we should go back to that, because there are a lot of things and a lot of the inefficiencies that we've talked about that were inappropriate. But we do need to have that. And no matter how much money is there in the system, there are things about healthcare, doing the work in healthcare, that are unpleasant. We deal with, wiping up, the mess of life in every sense. And if people don't have a sense of vocation and a recognition that there is real joy and purpose in this, and equally, hey, sometimes some of the things we do are extraordinarily cool. Even giving a routine anaesthetic, yes, I must admit, I still squirt in the propofol and watch the patient stop talking in mid-sentence. I think, that is really cool. This is a great party trick. and I think, we should sometimes, particularly, I suppose, people like me and you're getting up there, your hair's going grey.
I've been grey a while. Been grey a while.
Yep. That we should take the time to remind our younger colleagues that it is a real privilege to be in this job.
It really is.
And the great people you meet and the meetings you go to in London and so on. So, I think it's, we should always, take time to, if you like, smell the roses about what we're doing.
So let's finish them and looking forwards, Ross. Where do you think we're going from here? And I agree, it's a good time to smell the roses and look forwards.
Yeah, look, the extraordinary things that are happening in the cancer world. I've got 4 colleagues now who have had major cancer that they're living with. One had a melanoma with cerebral mets, and just as Keytruda came out, he's now still working 8 years later, I think it is. Colleagues with colorectal and with hepatic mets. But we're going to see many more patients who are living with cancer and with the immunotherapies, and we're going to have to deal with that as a long term because they'll be having recurrent surgical procedures. So the number of surgical procedures occurring will be increasing, and many of those patients will be patients who, as they walk in the door, I suppose we've seen the same thing with HIV, haven't we?
Absolutely.
Which used to be a death sentence, and now you barely, a routine patient with HIV on the therapies, and they've got a full life. But the preparation for surgery and coordination of all the drug therapies around surgery is going to be an ongoing challenge. And I think the other thing that we should look at is the amount of data that medicine used to be just a matter of dealing with the protoplasm of the patient. And over 500 years, we've defined the anatomy and physiology of the protoplasm and how it's divided into different organs and how it all works together and fits together. And I suppose, 150 years ago, psychiatry started dealing with the mind side of the mind-body divide and talking about all the different parts of the mind and the id and the ego and all those concepts. But now a lot of what we do is information. And in fact, we don't actually have to have the patient in front of us. We're just processing all that information. And yet we haven't got a standardized anatomy of what you might call the infoplasm. And if you're going to do it, the perioperative milieu would be the ideal place to do it because we have patients coming in all the time and we're gathering a whole lot of data. And even in the modern EHRs, electronic health records, it's still not organised in a way that's intuitive, and that we've agreed that this is the way we'll present it, if you like, that we've defined the anatomy of the infoplasm. And I think it would be great if at an international level we could sit down and say, these are all the data points that we'll gather routinely on every patient. And at the moment, in terms of risk prediction, I suppose the best we do is with NSQIP, and I think there are 26 data points on every patient in NSQIP. Well, that's hardly many, is it?
No, that's not many at all.
And yet, NSQIP does a pretty good job.
Yes.
But if we defined, say, for every diabetic, we will expect, say 20 data points to characterise their diabetes, and we'll record those routinely. And then once we're doing that, the magic of AI would take over and be able to really build up risk prediction and guide treatment much more effectively. But clinicians have to work out what that anatomy will be and how it will look like. So that's a challenge.
It is, but it's an exciting one, I think, and one that I'm looking forward to seeing developing over the coming years.
Yeah. So
let's finish on that note. Thank you very much again for your time, Ross. Thank you for joining us.
Okay.
The buzzers all move back into the common talk next session, so we should go enjoy them.
Yes.
So thank you for listening to Top Med Talk at home. As always, you can find us on our app, on our website, to your favourite podcasting platform. Make sure you also like and subscribe to us on all our social media channels. So you'll find us on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on X or formerly Twitter, and now YouTube as well. Give us a like, tick subscribe on there. That helps keep us free at the point of listening. And thanks again for joining in the conversation.
Top Med Talk. Thanks for downloading Top Med Talk. Don't forget to subscribe, check us out on YouTube, and of course on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook and X. Also, it's important to remember that Top Med Talk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that, and the way to do that is ebpom.org. Check out our website and find out about some of the incredible conferences we're going to be arranging across the year. ebpom.org.